Hi, everyone. We're going to proceed with our keynote speaker, and it's a real pleasure to introduce Karen Antebi. She serves as Economic Counselor for the Trade and NAFTA office at the Embassy of Mexico in Washington, D.C., where she leads Mexico's trade advocacy and communication strategies with the U.S. Congress, administration, and private sector. Before rejoining the Trade and NAFTA office at the Embassy of Mexico in 2016, Karen spent the past 3 years at BSA, the Software Alliance, leading the Global License Compliance Advocacy Program to encourage greater awareness of the importance of software compliance and digital risk among the C-suite, governments, and publicly listed companies. As economic counselor at the embassy, and previously as Chief of Staff to Mexico's Deputy Secretary of Commerce, Karen has coordinated the interests of numerous departments and agencies at the highest levels of government in Mexico, the United States, the European Union, and abroad. She is multicultural and bilingual. Karen holds a BA from Brandeis University and an MA in International Policy Studies from Stanford University. Thank you so much for joining us today, and please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker.
Who has the click? ¿Cuál es el click para cambiarlo? I'm just wondering where the click was. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to put these on so I can actually see you better. Thank you, Alvaro. Thank you for your kind words, and to Georgetown University for the invitation to be here today at the Future of NAFTA and the North American Economic Integration Conference. I am truly delighted to be here to share our views on NAFTA, what has been accomplished, and our vision forward towards modernizing our partnership with our North American neighbors. We're facing challenging times for trade. We seem to have entered an era marked by skepticism towards the global economy, including NAFTA. The anxiety is real, but withdrawing from NAFTA is not the solution to the problems we face. The overall economic growth and job creation delivered by NAFTA is evidence of this. As the U.S. Chamber of Commerce President and CEO Tom Donahue recently wrote in his Wall Street Journal opinion piece, quitting NAFTA would be an economic, political, and national security disaster. He noted that 14 million jobs depend on trade with Canada and Mexico, which are by far the United States' largest export markets. Mexico and Canada also buy more than $600 billion in U.S. manufactured goods each year, more than the next 10 largest markets combined. The risks of withdrawal are high, and we are preparing for that possibility. A robust economic agenda and trade diversity is a high priority for Mexico. Our network of free trade agreements award preferential access to 46 markets whose combined membership accounts for 70% of the world GDP. Mexico is participating in several negotiations right now, such as modernizing our FTA with the European Union and Japan, exploring markets in Brazil and Argentina, and engaging Australia and New Zealand with our Pacific Alliance partners. Yet the 23-year-old NAFTA was, in my mind, and continues to be the most ambitious free trade agreement of its time. It fully liberalized all trade in goods, including all agricultural products. It also established trade in services and investment across the region. And it established groundbreaking disciplines in government procurement, competition policy, and intellectual property rights. Additionally, it recognized the need to address labor and environmental protections. NAFTA became the model for trade negotiations to follow and ushered an unprecedented era of economic expansion across the globe. In my mind, NAFTA has contributed to Mexico's transformation on at least 3 fronts. First, it modernized Mexico's productive plant. It demonstrated to Mexicans and to the rest of the world that we can compete and compete successfully in world markets. Second, it transformed our relationship with the United States. We went from being distant neighbors to becoming strategic partners for production and prosperity. And third, and most important for me, it contributed to building transparent and accountable institutions. The free flow of goods also brought the free flow of ideas. It has empowered civil society and helped usher a new era of democracy. As you may know, Mexico shifted away from a closed import substitution model and development only 3 decades ago. In 1986, we joined the GATT, but it was really the entry into force of NAFTA that truly marked the turning point. Since then, the agreement has served to anchor Mexico's commitment to sound macroeconomic policies and free trade. Today, trade represents 63% of Mexico's GDP. Mexico is the 9th largest importer in the world, and with total exports reaching $374 billion, Mexico is the 10th largest exporter worldwide and first in Latin America. The bilateral trade relationship is very important. Mexico is the United States' second largest export market and second largest supplier of goods. Last year, our bilateral trade reached $525 billion, 6 times the exchanges prior to the entry into force of the agreement. Today, U.S.-Mexico trade supports nearly 5 million jobs in the United States and many million more in Mexico. Today, we trade over $1 million a minute. Mexicans buy 16% of U.S. sales worldwide. That is 1 out of every $6 that the U.S. receives in export revenue comes from Mexico. And U.S. exports to Mexico represent twice the combined revenue gains from sales to France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and double the U.S. exports to China. And within the next 5 years, we are poised to become the United States' top export market. In the U.S. alone, exports have contributed to over a third of the annual growth since the financial crisis of 2008. Trilateral trade under NAFTA has more than tripled, reaching nearly $1 trillion in 2016. NAFTA partners are each other's main suppliers. 53% of imports into Mexico, 60% of imports into Canada, and 28% of U.S. imports all come from NAFTA trading partners. The undeniable reality is that our economies are profoundly intertwined. We not only trade with each other, we produce together for world markets. From textiles to transportation equipment, many sectors have benefited from the agreement. They are reflective of an intricate value chain created across the 3 nations. We trade in the same sectors to maximize our competitive advantage. This is even more true in the manufacturing sector, where trade liberalization has enabled specialization and allowed us to leverage the complementarity of our production abilities to work together with our North American partners to create finished goods in electronics, computers, transportation equipment, autos, oil refined products, and many more. Altering the rules of origin could also pose a huge threat to integrated supply chains that all 3 countries benefit from in manufacturing. So manufactured goods in the North American region are produced through intermediate goods. One sector that specifically has been called into question is autos and auto part manufacturing. Mexico has been firm and consistent that country-specific rules of origin within the NAFTA would be unacceptable. It is not just Mexico who disagrees. John Bauzella, President and CEO of the Association of Global Auto Manufacturers, and Mitch Greenwald, President and CEO of the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers, emphasized that NAFTA, by encouraging open trade and investment, has been key to keeping the U.S. auto industry competitive. The U.S. automotive manufacturers argue that a focus on bilateral trade balances and content requirements threatens the integrated supply chains. They also say that changes to NAFTA's rules of origin would jeopardize the U.S. auto industry and the 7 million jobs that depend on it. NAFTA has strengthened supply chains and cross-border investment across North America. Together, Mexico and the United States produce goods and services for world markets. This is important because every time that Mexico exports, the United States exports too. In fact, on average, 40% of the content in Mexican exports of final goods is U.S. made. This means that U.S. producers gain about 40 cents out of every dollar spent on Mexican products worldwide. The United States depends on intermediate good imports from its North American neighbors more than from other parts of the world. Mexico and Canada purchase more manufactured goods from the United States than the next 10 countries combined. Undoubtedly, the certainty of market access under NAFTA has strengthened supply chains across North America from Yukon to the Yucatan. In the agricultural sector, trade liberalization has also promoted specialization of the types of goods traded between our countries, taking advantage of the complementarity of the regional climate and geography. U.S.-Mexico agricultural trade has increased fivefold over the past 23 years, surpassing $42 billion last year. And Mexico is the third largest destination for U.S. ag products and the second source for the U.S. As you know, energy fuels the economy, and success in the energy sector spills over to other industries like manufacturing, transportation, infrastructure, services, and more. The Wilson Center reports that total energy trade between the United States and Canada is at $140 billion per year, and at $65 billion with Mexico. Canada is the single largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the U.S., and both Mexico and Canada are major buyers of U.S. refined petroleum products. The U.S. is a net exporter of natural gas and refined products to Mexico. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that by 2029, Mexico's natural gas demand will grow by 31%. According to Jack Gerard, president and CEO of American Petroleum Institute, the U.S. is now the largest producer of oil and natural gas in the world. And this, coupled with enhanced energy integration with Canada and with Mexico, will increase long-term U.S. energy and national security. Together, North America has the resources and integrated supply chains to become energy independent. This gives the North American region a comparative advantage and competitive edge in the global economy by making us less reliant on energy sources from other parts of the world. So where are we? We recognize that there is a degree of uncertainty regarding our North American partnership. However, Mexico is committed to modernizing the agreement and to strengthen North America's lead in the 21st century economy, one that is driven by digital flows, innovation, and knowledge. Rather than focusing on disputes or rhetoric, we look towards building a constructive agenda, one in which we can work together for the benefits of our people on both sides of the border by promoting investment and reaching new sectors. Mexico is open to building on NAFTA's success and updating it. Such improvements should rely on further liberalization, deepen economic integration, and enhancing North America's competitiveness. Round 3 of the negotiations wrapped up in Ottawa on September 27th. Conceptual presentations were made by each of the parties, and negotiating groups began to work to advance text and proposals. Delegations will reconvene in the D.C. metropolitan area next week for the 4th round. For Mexico, this process is not about looking to the past, but about building the future. We strongly believe this process should do no harm. For Mexico, a NAFTA 2.0 must be based on 4 pillars. First, it should strengthen North America's competitiveness. Second, it should foster more inclusive and regional trade. Third, it should leverage the 21st century economy. And fourth, it should ensure certainty for trade and investment in North America. We think NAFTA should strengthen North America's competitiveness by maintaining preferential access and non-discriminatory treatment for trade in goods, services, and investment across the region. We should also create a level playing field for small and medium-sized enterprises through increased cooperation among NAFTA countries, adopt anti-corruption measures, improve border infrastructure, harmonize customs procedures, and incorporate gender perspectives. We must also take advantage of the 21st century economies by capitalizing on the synergies in North American energy markets, boosting the digital economy, and promoting the protection of intellectual property, as well as access and integration for the financial services and telecommunications sectors. Finally, we must also secure certainty for the North American investment through the modernization of dispute settlement mechanisms and enhancing the exchange of information between NAFTA countries. 2 decades ago, we were pioneers in devising an agreement that changed the international trade architecture. This time, we have a chance to be pioneers again. Let's reshape the way we interact, redefine our region, and make positive contributions to the international trading system. I feel most stakeholders in North America agree with these basic elements. We must avoid any scenario that would scale back the tremendous gains that we have achieved. The U.S. Congress, which has and will continue to play an important role in the process, has been supportive. They see a great opportunity to modernize North American trade. But they are also anxious about unintended consequences that could harm their constituents. Governments can't do this alone. The participation of businesses, farmers, consumers, academia, and civil society is needed to tell the full story. According to the last Chicago Council on Global Affairs report on public opinion on trade, a majority of Americans, actually 53%, believe that NAFTA is good for the U.S. economy. This is up from 42% in 2008. And 72% of Americans also believe that international trade is good for the U.S. economy. And for the first time since 2004, a majority of Americans also say that trade is good for creating jobs. We must decide which vision of global trade will win out in the end. Is it one that seeks to grow the pie, enhance our cross-border commerce, and facilitate greater joint production? Or is it one that seeks to split the pie? A vision of zero-sum trade, an us versus them mentality, where I fear the only winners will be our overseas competitors. Working together, we can ensure that North America remains the most innovative and competitive economic region in the world. The evidence is there. Trade is part of the solution to the challenges posed by globalization, not the problem. Trade is not zero-sum. It's about growing the pie. Thank you.
Now, Karen has graciously agreed to engage with the audience, so we have a few minutes for Q&A. And she will give the questions.
Oh, sure. Hi.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm Bethany Allen Abrahamian, a journalist at Foreign Policy magazine. Do you think that this rules of origin thing, the 50% auto parts that's recently come out, is that a red line for Mexico? Would you walk away from the negotiating table if that's something that the Trump administration continues with?
Well, as we all know, text has not been proposed yet. And there are a lot of rumors as to whether the United States will actually present a 50% domestic content provision in the rule of origin for autos. We have been very clear that domestic content is not something that we are interested in. So I believe that I'm not going to make any predictions. We will see where the fourth round goes. But it is clear that in order to grow the pie and for us to be more competitive, we need to work together, 3 countries.
Hi, Jack Capperell with Inside U.S. Trade. Thanks for being here. My question relates broadly to the negotiations so far. Is it your sense that the U.S. is coming from, in terms of some of the proposals they've tabled or have conceptually talked about, coming from a place where common ground can be found? So auto rule of origin would be one example, but then there are also ideas floating around about government procurement, for example, and investor-state dispute settlement that seem as non-starters for the other countries. So do you think that there's a chance to find common ground on some of the core issues And if so, is an end of the year agreement, in your view, still a possible timeline to get a deal?
So I feel that we are entering the fourth round. We've had 3 rounds where basically the teams have gotten to know each other, and then countries have more or less presented their positions. We are going to see where we go on the next round. The substance always drives the negotiation. So while we will continue to engage in a very ambitious calendar, and I would think it's premature for us to say where we might end up.
Hi, thank you again for your words. I'm Guillermo Garcia from Texas A&M School of Law. My question is related to the proposal from Canada to include indigenous protection for indigenous communities. Being Mexico, one of the countries that has the most amount of indigenous communities, and I believe it's around 10 million people in Mexico, we haven't heard anything from the Mexican government regarding the position they want to take on including both the labor, gender, and particularly indigenous rights in the treaty. Is there any particular position?
So in Mexico's negotiating objectives, there's clearly a reference to including gender perspective into certain parts of the agreement, and it clearly it speaks to how do we expand the benefits of the trade agreement to more sectors, more enterprises, small and medium-sized companies, more regions, and clearly gender is another sector we're looking into. As you know, Mexico has been implementing a far-reaching constitutional and legislative labor reforms, and we've also discussed the possibility, as we did then through TPP negotiations, of including labor into the agreement. So I feel that there are conversations ongoing through that.
Hello, thank you. I'm Melinda St. Louis from Public Citizen. You mentioned the negotiating objectives around investment, and one question I had is, given that investor-state dispute settlement in the United States has become very controversial, I mean, around the world it's controversial, but with the reports that we've heard that potentially the United States might be proposing an opt-in or opt-out proposal on investor-state dispute settlement. I was wondering if you could comment what Mexico's position or initial thoughts might be about something like that, particularly since Mexico has actually paid, I think, nearly $200 million in claims, investor-state claims, and faces many more claims from U.S. investors, whether it would be prudent potentially for Mexico to consider opting out if that is on the table.
So as you clearly mentioned, Secretary Guajardo, in the statement that he provided our Senate in July, outlined that we are committed to modernizing all of our NAFTA dispute mechanisms, including investor-state, to make them more agile, more transparent, and more effective. So at this point, I mean, I think that we are looking to figuring out how we modernize it and engage in them in that sense. We are not at that stage yet, I would say. I think we're interested in looking how we modernize them and how we clearly provide rules for everybody that applies across the board.
So thank you very much for your remarks. I'm Álvaro Santos on the faculty here. I'm really pleased that we have a chance to engage with the Mexican perspective today. And I wanted to ask you 2 questions. One is about the process of the negotiations, not so much with the other parties, but in Mexico. One has the impression, or at least I have the impression, that the process hasn't been that opened to different members in civil society, that the government is in talks and obviously well supported by the private sector, but that the kind of opening that we've seen perhaps in Canada and the United States, where there's a process of public commenting and positions done in a way that where there's a forum with the participation perhaps in Mexico of the Senate, that hasn't happened, or it hasn't really been very visible. And I wonder if what your position is there, if I'm wrong, or if there's any plan to actually open up more that space. And the second question is if you could comment on whether there's any attempt to bring in the topic of trade in labor or migration to what could be a new version of NAFTA. I wouldn't be surprised if there's resistance from the other parties, but to what extent is Mexico pushing that? Thanks.
Thank you. So to your first question, you're wrong. We started to engage the private sector, civil society in February. And a consultative mechanism was established way back in February, and the secretary has held, I was looking to see if I have actually the number of like hundreds of meetings that he has had across all sectors. He's also appeared before the Senate multiple times, as has our deputy secretary and our chief negotiator. And finally, we opened a comment period through the internet that was available. I think that comment period was opened in June. Once Lighthizer was confirmed, then there was a comment period that was open for anyone to submit comments. So on that front, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. On your second question, I am not in the U.S. government, but I believe that there is certain provisions that outline what the U.S. can and cannot engage on, and I feel there would have to be a U.S. lawyer that can support this. That immigration is not one of the issues that they can engage on by statute at this point. Hi, Doug. Be nice to me.
Hi, Doug Palmer with Politico. Well, you just said at the opening of your remarks, you said there was a risk of withdrawal, and Mexico was preparing for that contingency. I don't know if you could just elaborate a little bit on that.
Of course, I mean, there is that risk. It's out there. And while we are deeply committed and engaged in this negotiating process with the United States, and we are all very focused on it because we are here, we also have a negotiating team that is addressing the updating of our free trade agreement with the European Union, and we have a very ambitious calendar there to conclude negotiations by the end of the year. We have worked to and continue to work with our Pacific Alliance partners in deepening that relationship and figuring out how to bridge the Americas Pacific with Asia Pacific, and how do all the work that we did through TPP, how do we bring those together? And so we've got Australia and New Zealand as being the first countries to be looking into how can they actually join the Pacific Alliance, which is a very ambitious agreement. In addition to that, certainly, the negotiations that have gone underway with Brazil and Argentina are still there, and those include ag and autos, from A to A, and Japan. And our president was in China earlier in September, so clearly we're not standing still.
Okay, thanks. And the other question I had was about the labor chapter, which I only know in the vaguest of terms. There's a Canadian proposal, there's a U.S. proposal. The U.S. labor groups seem to prefer the Canadian proposal to the U.S. proposal. And I just wondered if Mexico, if they prefer one or the other. And is there anything in the U.S. proposal that's markedly different than what Mexico agreed to in the TPP? Is the U.S. asking for anything different in the NAFTA talks than you've already agreed to in TPP?
Well, I would just say that TPP, that ship sailed when the U.S. stepped out.
Right.
So we're looking at it from our floor is NAFTA. and we're engaging with our trading partners to see where we end up.
Okay. Are they asking you to like raise the minimum wage in a specific way? I mean, or is it because they talked about wanting to?
I mean, there are a lot of proposals out there, and we clearly don't believe it's the issue of wages. We're not engaged in establishing artificial wages. I mean, it's not in the interest of any NAFTA member to manipulate wages in Mexico, nor is it something that's achievable through open markets and free trade.
Okay. Thank you.
So I'm curious about the pace of the negotiations. Obviously,
they're not sleeping.
Yeah, exactly. They've been described in various terms, everything from light speed to something else. And on the other hand, obviously, I think everybody knows that does negotiations that one of the things that takes the longest often is developing an intra-government position. I mean, I used to do negotiations where people would say to me, what's the hardest part of the negotiations? And I would always say the hardest part is getting the U.S. government on the same page, because I would have, the Labor Department wanting one thing, the Treasury Department wanting something else, the State Department wanting something else, et cetera. So my question to you is, does it feel like light speed, and is there enough time for you within Mexico to figure out an intra-Mexican position? And do you understand that the United States has done the work that they need to do to have a clear intra-U.S. Position? How much text is really actually being put on the table, I would say, particularly by the United States? And do you think this pace can continue at this point? In the way that it's going?
So what I won't do is I won't speak for the United States and what they're doing. I can't do that. But I can say that Mexico has a very professional, very seasoned team of trade negotiators that have been working together since NAFTA negotiations and beyond, and we really haven't stopped. So we are a strong team. Our interagency process is very fluid. We've got representatives of agencies at the negotiating table. And clearly, we have the benefit of just coming out of the 5-year TPP negotiation. So we know, or we are very sensitive to what our industry wants and what the policies have been from different agencies and where other stakeholders in civil society lie. As far as the pace, yeah, it is really, really ambitious, and we're committed to it. We feel clearly it is in our best interest to provide the certainty to the markets. Having said that, it is the substance that drives the negotiation, and so once we can, I feel that if we agree to the common objectives, we can achieve a good agreement in the end.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Danny Bahar from Brookings. Thanks for having me. Your follow-up on your last phrase, which is if we agree on the objectives, we can have a good agreement. But the objectives, I think, I just wanted to get your sense if there is an agreement at all on objectives, because the objectives of the U.S., from what we see in the media, is, to use maybe the right word, to obsessively look at the trade deficit. So I wonder if you can comment on whether Mexico is... What is the take of Mexico on this goal of the U.S. and whether Mexico is willing to give up any concessions, quote unquote, or low-hanging fruit that could relieve that rhetoric on the U.S. side?
So, in a nutshell, we feel that the best way to address the trade deficit is by increasing North America's share in the exports of world markets. Grow the pie.
I mean the bilateral trade.
That's the way to do it as well. Expand the pie.
I agree. But...
Mario Osorio from Georgetown University. I was wondering whether you could comment a second on Mexico's position regarding Chapter 19. Chapter 19 seems very critical in terms of the positions that the U.S. and Canada hold, and Mexico has stated that is exploring the possibility, or that it would like to modernize the anti-dumping and countervailing duty mechanism, but that leaves a lot room to wonder what that really means, and where Mexico stands in this issue, which seems to be an issue in which the U.S. and Canada really clash on. So I was wondering if you could just comment briefly on or elaborate more on Mexico's position there.
So as you said, I mean, we're committed to modernizing the dispute settlement mechanisms. In order for these to work, you have to have the rosters filled out. The rules are clear. I mean, Chapter 19, what it does is it basically sets out a revision to ensure that investigating authorities or competent authorities to reduce the discretionality within them. And I feel that that principle is one that we believe in.
Hi. Hi. My name is Isaid Escobar. I come from Mexico, and I just have one question. What is the first issue to negotiate? The first interest of Mexico about negotiate the intellectual property and technology? That's my question.
What is Mexico's position with regards to intellectual property? Is that the question?
Yeah, exactly.
So we clearly and technology, digital flows, technology.
Digital, for example.
I mean, clearly, we believe that this is an area that it's symbolic of the 21st century, and we're fully engaged in this, in negotiating and finding common ground there.
Okay, but what is the first issue to negotiate in the NAFTA about technology?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Si
I
quieres,
mean,
dímelo en español.
Okay. I mean, if is there a problem? Is there a topic on technology? One specific topic, the most important interest of Mexico. Like, for example, there is intellectual property. There's one, but there is a lot of kinds of topics of technologies. Property intellectual is one, but maybe it's another one that it's maybe tal vez no se ha tocado otro tema en específico de.
I mean, we're fully engaged in looking at all the elements that are comprised in you know, in the IT sector and in the digital economy and e-commerce. It runs across chapters and specific chapters as well. I'm just not understanding your question, but I'm happy to discuss it with you afterwards if you have some time.
Of course. Well, that's all. Thank you.
Oh, here we go again.
I'm sorry, but he mentioned intellectual property, and I was just curious about this the biologics provision. I don't know if you remember that from the TPP, but
I do.
That was that was very controversial, and
so do you remember my answer on the TPP?
Oh, that ship has sailed, I think is what you said.
Exactly.
Well, okay. So then I guess my question is, I mean, the U.S. wants 12 years, according to Senator Hatch and USTR. Can Mexico live with 12 years of data protection for biologics?
We're just in the negotiating process. It's just the third date.
Okay. So you're undecided at this point, or?
We've only gone out in 3 days. Okay. I'm not going to tell you what we're going to do next.
Okay. All right.
Hi, my name My name is Iñaki. I'm a recent graduate of American University, Washington College of Law. My question was more on looking into the negotiation right now. The United States is planning to issue a Section 201 remedy on imports of
Washers.
cells, solar cells.
Oh, solar.
Solar cells, and I know that Mexico would be affected because a lot of imports come from Mexico to the United States. How will that change maybe the dynamics on the negotiation, especially because NAFTA does have a special provision, but it might be violated anyways?
You said like so many things. You actually even gave me the answer. So yes, if you are adopting a safeguard according to Chapter 8 of NAFTA, the party has the obligation to compensate. So we will see. And if that, I mean, you're already presuming a whole bunch of things. Is it going to happen? Are we going to request compensation? And they're going to deny compensation. I can't.
I guess my question is, would that affect the negotiations as talking points for the NAFTA 2.0 as in safeguards?
Well, I mean, I think each country is reserving the right to continue to adopt its trade policy, and the merits of those decisions have to drive the decisions that are made. And at the same time, you have to live up to your commitments in international trade negotiation, in your international trade agreements.
Right.
So if the decision was made, then we would have recourse, and we would look to have to implement such recourse.
All right, thanks.
Thank you for being here. My name is Khalid Kamal. I'm a second-year law student. I'm from Saudi Arabia as well. You were talking earlier, our Professor Hillman was talking about the example on sugar, where the United States went and complained to the WTO. In the new negotiations of the NAFTA, is it possible that there be a clause where all disputes between the NAFTA countries remain in NAFTA away from going to any other dispute resolution mechanism or panel? Because it seems like that undermines the NAFTA agreement.
Well, I mean, you have an exclusion clause. You either go WTO or you go NAFTA or you go through your domestic court system. But I think it would be hard to limit the ability of the parties to say you can only do it this way if you're already a member of another club. You get to choose which dance you go to.
Doesn't that undermine the NAFTA agreement in a way?
I don't think so.
Thank you.
Sure, Antonio, go for it. Be nice to me.
Yes. I'm Antonio Ortiz with the Albright Stonebridge Group. You presented a lot of very useful information in the PowerPoint. Very beautiful. Okay. But I think some of it might get lost in the details. So I wanted to ask you if you can explain in your own words how Mexico and a new NAFTA is a part of the solution for the things the U.S. is looking for, which is to create more jobs, to export more, to reduce its trade deficit with other countries. If you could just lay that down in simple terms, because a lot of people in the U.S. think that Mexico is the problem. And I take the exact opposite view, that the U.S. will not prosper without Mexico. So you just spell that out.
I mean, part of thank you, Antonio. So nice of you. You might remember I laid out there's a 40% U.S. content of Mexican final exports to world markets. What does this mean? Today, competition is not between countries, it's between regions. And so the ability to compete is inextricably linked to our ability to trade and produce together. So every time that Mexico exports 40% of what we send out, or 600 billion, goes to the U.S. And the way that then when the U.S. exports and has Mexico value added into it, it also grows. So what we're looking to do is to expand markets so that we can continue to grow. Okay. I think we're done.
Thank you very much, Karen. And please join me in thanking Karen and Teddy for this wonderful time.